Hi everyone, welcome to Cold War Spaces. My name is Anna Rose Canzano. I'm the Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thanks so much for joining us today for this program. Today's topic is anti-racist space, Paul Robeson between East and West. And we're so honored today to welcome Allison Blakely as our guest. He is Professor Emeritus of European and Comparative History at Boston University and the author of Blacks in the Dutch World, The Evolution of Racial Imagery in a Modern Society, and an American Book Award-winning book on Blacks in Russian history and thought. He's also the author of several articles on Russian populism and others on various European aspects of the Black diaspora. His interest in comparative history has centered on populism, the history of democracy, and on the historical evolution of color prejudice. He is currently a Berlin Prize Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin and is working on an interpretive history of the Black diaspora in Europe. Among other honors and awards Blakely has received are Woodrow Wilson, Mellon Fulbright Hayes, and Ford Foundation Fellowships. And in 2010, he was appointed by President Obama to a term on the National Council for the Humanities. Today's program will be about a 30-minute conversation between Allison and Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. After that, there will be about 15 minutes for Q&A from the audience, so please get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time. We appreciate all questions, please, so that we can get to everyone's. Please keep them short, no longer than a sentence or two. For other comments and discussion, please use the chat box. And as we're getting started, it's always nice if you say hi and what city you're tuning in from. We'll be posting the recording of today's program on our Vimeo page and also in podcast format on our SoundCloud page. And lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And now I'll pass it off to Yus to get started with the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, Anna Rose, thank you very much. And Allison, thank you for joining us. And welcome to Cold War Space. It's great to have you in the series. May I start with a personal question? When in your life did you first hear about Paul Robeson, and what does he mean to you?
Well, Paul Robeson is one of my few heroes of the 20th century and in the civil rights movement. I think I first became aware of him through reading accounts in the Black press. I, as a boy, would read the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier. And I knew about him, but I didn't come to admire him until when in my freshman year in high school, I took my first course in Russian language, and my Russian language teacher brought a record to class of Paul Robeson singing Russian songs in Russian. And I was hooked from that point on, because those songs, the Russian songs he sang, reminded me of Negro spirituals that I had grown up singing. And if we have about 3 minutes, I could try to demonstrate to you why that reminded me of my own background. I selected two songs, the traditional Russian song, Evening Bell, Вечерний звон, and Motherless Child is a spiritual. Okay. Вечерний звон, вечерний звон, как много дум наводит он. О юных днях в краю родном, где я любил, где отчий дом, и как я с ним навек простясь, там слышал звон. последний раз. Now you'll have to imagine that being sung by a real Russian singer at a much, much slower pace. And at the end of each line, a boom, boom, or a bell sound. I didn't want to take up too much time here. Motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home, a long way from home. And for the non-Russian audience, this is my rough translation of Evening Bell. The evening bell, the evening bell, it carries so many thoughts about the days of my youth in my native land, where I first learned to love, where my father's house is, and about how, as I said goodbye to him forever and heard the evening bell for the last time. So I felt that affinity. And then later, when I studied more about Paul Robeson, I read his actual discussion of this same subject, indicating that he thought that he had a special affinity to Russians because of the shared experience of slavery, and in their case, serfdom. I mean, there was slavery in Russia, but it was eliminated in the 18th century for the benefit of the government. And in the case of serfdom, the emancipation came at roughly the same time our emancipation from slavery. And Paul Robeson was very knowledgeable about all this. And he thought that of all the different traditions of music that he sang in, that Russia was the one that he felt closest to, and he thought it was because of this shared experience of the Russian people and the African American experience under slavery and then Jim Crow.
Right. Well, thank you so much. First of all, this is the first live experience, live performance we have had in this series so far. Really wonderful to hear your voice. And I can imagine also for you, hearing both these Soviet songs and the Negro spirituals made a spiritual connection, probably.
Yes, I think it's unquestionable.
Right. So when Robeson first visited the Soviet Union in 1934, he was actually invited by filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein, who planned to make a film about the revolution in Haiti. And I would like to ask you, as Lenin made it a point in a 1920s speech, to deal with what he calls the Negro question, meaning that he envisioned a society that would get rid of discrimination and racism. So my question would be, how was Paul Robeson received in the Soviet Union in 1934? And generally speaking, how would you say was dealt with the question of racism in the Soviet Union? Did it exist, and what form did it take?
Well, in that period, there was a small cluster of African Americans who went to the Soviet Union, and they were actually, in many ways, like quite a few others that didn't go to Russia but went to France and other parts of Europe, they were trying to find someplace where they could feel like whole human beings. And at the same time, this was a very, in many ways, horrible period in the Soviet Union, because in the haste to bring Russia once again up into the category of leading political powers, there was a very intense mobilization of all resources involving forced collectivization and unfortunately also a bloody political purge. And so Robeson's visiting at that time is quite interesting, but in terms of the kind of experience those African Americans could have, they were actually kept away from the most horrible things that were happening, and they were shown such positive things as some efforts at bringing about more social justice in terms of issues like race and ethnicity, because the Soviet Union, in its constitution, it actually provided for a house of its Congress that represented the different non-Slavic nationalities. And they could point to that. And they could point to the fact that in the Soviet constitution, they actually outlawed concepts and practices like racism, whereas you couldn't find anything like that in the US Constitution to this day. Right. And so these African American visitors looking for some kind of place, and especially the Soviet Union, the reason they thought that there was some chance that it might be able to live up to its ideals is that it was brand new. It was like building up from the ground again after the trauma of the First World War, and recovering, and Russia was also had suffered from famine and other kinds of issues. So they thought that this was at least a place where there's a chance they might mean what they were claiming in their right. propaganda.
Right, right. So I would say since the mid or maybe late 1930s, Paul Robeson started to really advocate for progressive causes worldwide. During the Second World War, he advocated a lasting friendship between the United States and the Soviet Union, possibly also because he hoped a positive Soviet influence on domestic racism in the United States. Of course, that's evolved quite differently, I guess, than he had hoped. Shortly after the Second World War, the Cold War started, the tensions between the superpowers, but also African Americans were still very much part of this country with Jim Crow laws and segregation. And I want to mention one really disturbing example. In 1946, there was a series of lynchings in the South. And Robeson spoke with President Henry Truman and asked him to take action against those lynchings. And Truman flatly refused to do so, saying it was not politically opportune at that point. First of all, of course, an outrageous response. And I would like to ask you, was that normal, such a response in this time? But also, how did it impact Paul Robeson's subsequent political activism?
Well, sadly, President Truman was actually right in realizing he couldn't do that at that time. And sadly, to this very day. In 2021, for some reason, our country has not figured out a way to pass a national law against lynching to this very day. So it's not surprising that President Truman didn't do it just after the war. And the second part of your question, I'm not sure I fully understood it.
So my question is whether this conversation with Truman somehow impacted Robeson's subsequent political activism.
The subsequent?
His political stance, his political actions. And,
well, I mean, obviously, he was very disappointed. And it's a very complicated subject because, you know, when Robeson first came back to the United States, his progressive views were not necessarily a problem. And then during the Second World War, the Soviet Union was actually our ally. And during the Second World War, Paul Robeson was one of the leaders, high-profile figures, who was raising money for US war bonds. He was so bitterly opposed to fascism of the German, the Italian, and Japanese variety that even though he was still critical of the United States and its shortcomings with respect to progress on racial justice, he was just totally patriotic and opposed to the fascists. And he didn't really change in terms of his political beliefs from early 20th century on through to the end. The problem was that there were changing political winds at home. And when you had McCarthyism come into full swing, for example, it was not going to be possible for someone with the kinds of strongly held views that he held and someone unwilling to bend in public. He was just not going to be a good fit for the rest of his life because he still wanted the United States to live up to its ideals, just as he wanted the Soviet Union to live up to its ideals. And as I see it, the reason that in some cases he actually romanticized the achievements of the Soviet Union to try to make a point. And he felt that if he would come out strongly as a critic of the Soviet Union, and I'm not sure he knew just how horrible all of the atrocities that were being committed under Stalin. But he felt that if he publicly came out as a strong critic, that he would be taking pressure off the United States. And it was his patriotism, his dedication to the United States that made him feel his duty was to just keep pressure on because there was not enough pressure coming from other quarters.
Right, and that cost him his passport, and he was also subpoenaed
by
the House Un-American Activities Committee. So
it cost him his whole career. He was a wealthy man, and of course it destroyed his wealth. It also destroyed his health. There was really no option for him if he was not willing to relent. He was given the opportunity when he came back to settle back in the States after having lived for over a decade abroad, and mainly in England. He was asked to sign an affidavit that he was not a communist. Well, to my knowledge, he never joined the Communist Party, but on principle, he refused to sign that. So in some ways, he had options. he could have just towed the line and said things he didn't believe, but he wasn't willing to do that.
No, I understand. So Robeson was extremely popular in the Soviet Union when he performed there. There were long, long lines. In 1949, a mountain in Kazakhstan was named after Robeson. In 1952, he received the Stalin Peace Prize. Would you say that apart, of course, from real admiration for Robeson, was there also an element of the use of propaganda there? Did the Soviet government use Robeson in its anti-American stance?
Well, I think he was so popular in part because he was a very convenient symbol for the Soviet propaganda machine, because he epitomized. I mean, he was the son of a slave, someone who had been born a slave, and his lifelong struggle for racial justice made him literally a poster child for the Soviet propaganda machine. But I think he was also popular and highly popular because he was a good singer. I think there's such a deeply entrenched tradition of love of great music and great singers in Russian history, not just Soviet Russia, but going all the way back. I mean, if you read Lermontov's novel, you know, the notes, the sportsman sketches, there's a short story in there about singing, and that captures perfectly the Russian love of singers and poets. And I don't think the Soviet Union was able to destroy that.
No, interesting, yeah. So Robeson is a really remarkable figure, however you look at it. He was a great singer, of course, but also a stage and film actor. He was a football player. He played for the Rutgers University team. He was a professional lawyer. He studied many languages, among which Mandarin and Swahili. He spoke between 12 to 20 languages fluently, depending on who you ask. He was a very effective civil rights activist. He had conversations with George Bernard Shaw, A.G. Wells, with Albert Einstein, and many others, also politicians. How would you explain his incredible success in a country with Jim Crow laws that make it so difficult for African Americans to develop themselves?
Well, sometimes you have to give special credit to persons who have special gifts. And he had a determination coupled with tremendous talent. I mean, he seemed to take segregation as a challenge rather than as an impediment. You know, at Rutgers as an undergraduate, he was twice named an All-American, and he achieved that after initially having to prove himself on the football field. He was viciously attacked by one of his racist teammates, right, who blindsided him and temporarily injured him. When he came back from his injury, he picked out that one individual in practice and disabled him. And after that, he never had any trouble. But still, when they played other teams, segregation resulted in his having to be separated from the team. He couldn't go into all of the places the rest of his team. And he didn't let that stop him. Then he went to Columbia and got a law degree, and he was discriminated against in the reputable law firm he was in. He didn't let that stop him. In fact, that's what inspired him to go off and become an entertainer. He discovered his talent in Manhattan and other places. And that is what really made his career. But he was a personality who just didn't see walls as obstacles. He saw them as something that he needed to climb or move out of the way.
Right. Yeah, it's incredibly impressive. Before we move to the Q&A, I want to ask you one final question about the here and now. You have mentioned that in his 1951 anthology of poems, Dream Deferred, Langston Hughes, who had, by the way, visited the Soviet Union just like Paul Robeson, asked the question how long it would take before African Americans could be part of the American dream. And we had such a political roller coaster of a decade with, first of all, the first Black American president, then a white supremacist presidency, but also, of course, the rise of Black Lives Matter. How would you say, where do we stand at this point in with the question whether the American dream is open to African Americans?
You know, for the first time in my life, I've actually been optimistic by what has happened recently. And I think it's because all of my life and all of my adult life, I've never wanted all of Americans to come out and vote because I always assumed that I was in such a racist society that the wrong majority would be out there voting. And now what's happened recently is that thanks to our former president, all of the fig leaves have been lifted and we can see clearly, and the world can see clearly what the reality is. And now I'm hopeful we'll actually deal with it. We'll either deal with it or we'll never be a great country again. And so as far as the dreams are concerned, I think that Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream has maybe materialized to a certain extent, in that if you look at the pictures of the past year with literally tens of thousands of people all over the world marching with the Black Lives Matters protests, what they're doing is demonstrating that Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream and the American dream may actually have finally merged. And I'm hopeful of this, especially because the majority of the people in those marches have been white. Mm-hmm. And so, but the one caveat is that the two dreams have merged, but it's still just a big dream unless we do something to actually make it a reality.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Allison. And let's go to the Q&A. There are already quite some questions. The first is from Vladimir Paperny. He writes, there have been unconfirmed rumors that in 1961, Paul Robeson attempted to kill himself in a hotel in Moscow, being disillusioned in the Soviet government. Is there any truth to that?
Well, unfortunately, I really have no kind of information on that. I am aware of some of those rumors. I've read about them, but I'm not sure we'll ever know all of that story because I don't think even if we had access to CIA and FBI files that we would be able to answer that question fully.
Right. Next question is from Disa Lindgren. Paul Robeson was a person of such excellence in so many fields and ways. His brilliance and competence were largely unappreciated in the US during his lifetime because of racism. but he was beloved and respected by many people in the world and by some in this country. His dedication to the struggle for justice is an inspiration for people today. He was widely read, but I wonder if you know how Paul Robeson first became interested in the Soviet Union.
How he first became interested in it?
Yeah.
Well, I think you mentioned it at the very beginning of our session. He was invited to the Soviet Union by Eisenstein. And it was what he observed there that I think led him to believe that there was some chance that the Soviet Union, especially because it's a major power, and a major, well, it's very diverse in makeup, but he was thinking, if there's ever going to be great progress made in terms of racial justice, if you have at least one major power that goes all out to bring about that, then that's the route to take. And I think he's always thought that the Soviet Union could put pressure on the United States. And I think he was right to some extent, because if you think about the advances that have been made in social justice in the United States, maybe I'm a cynic, but I've always felt that the most important developments seem to always happen for the wrong reason. I don't think the progress that we made in civil rights was brought about for the right reason. I think it in part was a product of the Cold War competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviets were able to embarrass us in front of the whole world at the very moment when the African and Asian countries were coming out of the colonial domination of the major Western countries. And the United States, if it wanted to remain a leading, powerful state, it was going to have to get its act in order. And so that's what we saw the beginning of in the 1960s. And what we're seeing now in this sort of Armageddon struggle that seems to be symbolized by this recent attempted coup, we're seeing an attempt by part of our society to roll back those gains of the last half century. And so if you think about the Pledge of Allegiance of the United States, you can no longer really say that there's liberty and justice for all. That's what the Black Lives Matter protests are protesting against. And you can't say that it's one nation indivisible. So we're going to have to pick up these pieces and put them back together.
Right. There is a question from Robert Hager, which I think you just answered, actually. He asked about the lack of criticism from Robeson towards the totalitarian aspects in the Soviet Union and China. But I think we answered that. The next question is by Michelle Willens. She writes, Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier are two men who admired and befriended Robeson. He even gave Harry Belafonte the title of his book, Sing Your Song. Do you think he impacted many? I'm not sure I understand this question.
You know, one thing I had wanted to say in response to something you said earlier, is that there was a window of time when Paul Robeson was extremely popular in this country. He was on a level of, let's say, a Sinatra or somebody like that. It's just when the politics got so complicated in the later century after the war that he, in effect, was robbed of his citizenship and of his career, blackballed in such a way that he was made into sort of a non-person. But there was a period when he was extremely popular in the broad American public.
Right, right. The next question is from Kenneth Snyder. What was the outcome of the Robeson-Patterson's petition to the UN, We Charge Genocide? Do you know about it?
Well, it was unsuccessful, if that's what you want to know.
Right.
It was an idea whose time hadn't come yet.
No. Do you know anything about the circumstances when this petition was formulated and what brought Robeson to do it at that time?
Well, I think it was simply a kind of proposal that was intended to create a different approach to solving these related problems. It's sort of like the different proposals that have been put forward for reparations. It was a way of trying to raise the consciousness of the public about the nature of what we've been facing. And that kind of language was just not well received. And it still isn't, because there's a tendency here and in other major countries not to want to even talk about genocide. There's a very strong tendency among the European countries not to want to talk about the Holocaust.
Right, right. The next question is from Mark Lipman. After the US took his passport away, Paul Robeson went and gave a concert on the US side of the Canadian border, attended by thousands, which was a brilliant use of creative direct action to overcome the obstacles put in front of him. Could you speak more on his ability and creativeness in highlighting the social and racial struggles of his day?
Well, you've said so much about him in glowing terms that I can't think of anything more that I can say. But that incident, that example is another of what I raised in my earlier comment about his not being willing to accept obstacles as obstacles. That was a very creative way, but unfortunately, you can only do that about once, and you don't solve the problem with that. But it showed the artificiality of the kind of restrictions that had been placed on him.
Right. Since we at this point don't have other questions, I am taking the opportunity to ask another one myself. You actually met Martin Luther King Jr. in 1959 at an international conference. Can you share some experiences? How was it to interact with him, and what was the circumstance? What was the occasion?
With Paul Robeson?
No, with Martin Luther King.
Oh,
yeah.
I was a sophomore in college out in Oregon, and I was participating in one of the campus religious youth groups, and we took a long train and bus ride out to the University of Ohio, Athens, and there was a 3-day International Youth Congress. And Martin Luther King Jr. Flew in for 2 days and had an opportunity to interact with him in one session with just less than a dozen of us for, maybe 45 minutes or so. And it was very interesting to me at the time. Of course, I didn't know he was going to become immortal, or I might have taken more notes. But I actually admired him more than anyone I'd met up to that time. I was 19, he was 30, and I asked him if I should join his movement. And he told me, he said, "Where are you from?" I said, I'm in college in Oregon. And he smiled and he said, "Brother, we need you out there." He said, you should go back and finish college. And that impressed me a lot because, well, I'm from Alabama originally. He's from Georgia, but he made some reputation in Alabama. I had thought of him as someone who would be, well, not an empire builder, but who would be welcoming disciples or followers. And he was not that at all. And I never forgot that he really was what he claimed to be. and what he was doing, it was not about him. It was about the cause that he was serving.
Right, right. We have a question from Sky Arndt Briggs. Do you think that it is important, and will it be possible to rehabilitate Robeson's reputation and memory in the US?
I think time will restore. No, history sometimes it's much kinder than the present. And if you look at him and his career objectively, I can't see any way that if we survive the turmoil that we have right now, I can't see him not emerging as one of the most positive figures of the whole struggle.
Right, thank you. And then we have a question from Colleen. She says, "Greetings, I am a classical singer and this lecture has been very insightful and inspiring. I would like to know, how do you feel Robeson's legacy has had an impact upon artists of the African diaspora in both the US and Russia today?"
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question. It's an excellent question, but I don't think I have the breadth of knowledge to give a good answer.
Right. Well, okay, Allison, I want to thank you very, very much for an amazing conversation. Again, I will never forget your opening with the 2 songs, which was wonderful. Thank you for being part of this interview series.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Great. So next week we have an interview with Timur Bekbusonov. He is an opera singer, performance artist, film producer, and researcher. Also a combination that sounds pretty impressive. And with him, I will talk about Soviet-era public murals in Almaty in Kazakhstan. So please join me next week for the next interview. And thank you all for watching. Have a wonderful week.